We are back on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio, News Talk, 1180, 1230 KGEO, 1410 KERI, now in Albuquerque, New Mexico on 1000 KKIM, and 3 times a week on the Internet nationwide on knookmedia.com. And, Clay, anybody who wants to listen to any of our shows for the last 4 years, they are on the Internet on Clay and Marty Show. Our guest by phone is a gentleman we've had the pleasure of interviewing before, former Secret Service agent Clint Hill. So, Clint, I had a question for you that it was a great book, Mrs. Kennedy and Me, and I've enjoyed both of your books. One of the things I remember, there was a story in there about Mrs. Kennedy was going out to, I think, the Greek islands, and this is long before, President Kennedy was still alive, but he made the comment, keep Mrs. Kennedy away from Onassis.
Well, that was back in 1961.
What was that all about? Did you ever really figure out why he...
Yes, yeah, pretty much. So I was given the responsibility of making the advance arrangements for that trip for Mrs. Kennedy. So I was going to go from doing an advance for them in Paris down to Athens to set it up for Mrs. Kennedy, who was coming there alone, with her sister, but the president was not going to be there. And so I was summoned to the Oval Office one day before I left, and the president asked me, he had said, I understand you're going to do the advance in Greece for Mrs. Kennedy. I said, yes, Mr. President. He said, one thing I want to make sure of, and that is when Mrs. Kennedy is in Greece, I do not want her to cross paths with Aristotle Onassis. I said, yes, sir, Mr. President, that'll be the case. So I'm back in my office, started to think about that, tried to figure out why. Called a friend of mine who was an agent in Chicago who was of Greek origin and had family in Greece. In fact, his uncle was the chief of police in Athens. And asked him if he had any idea why this might be the case. And he said, yes, he did. He said, Onassis has recently been sued by the United States government for over $7 million because of some problem that he had regarding the Liberty ships that he had acquired from the United States. He said, there's a congressional election coming up in 1962. He said, I'm sure they do not want a photograph of Mrs. Kennedy and Onassis to appear because it would be detrimental to anybody in the Democratic Party running for office. And so that was really the reason. There was no other reason because, and we did not see Onassis at all during that trip.
Mm-hmm. What was it like to watch Mrs. Kennedy, versus some of the other people that you watched over the years?
Well, she and I became very close friends. She relied on me a great deal for many, many things. It was a pleasure to be around her. She was very, very smart, very articulate, very athletic. She loved to do a variety of things. She was an excellent horsewoman. She loved to water ski. She played golf, played tennis. But she was a very down-to-earth person, which many, many people do not quite know about or understand. She was a hands-on mom that, although they had a nanny, anything that was done around the children was supervised by her. And she was a devoted wife to the president. She continuously made plans for little private dinner parties in the White House right after work to give the president a chance to come over and be among friends and just unloosen that tie and put his feet up and get a few minutes of relaxation whenever he could.
Clint, once the president leaves office, is there still Secret Service protection for the family?
Yes, there is. There's a protection for former presidents throughout their lifetime and for their wives. In the case of the Kennedy children, a law was passed after the assassination to protect John and Caroline until they reached the age of 16. And then Mrs. Kennedy lost her protection once she married Onassis.
So it's like a divorce. Once there's a death, and that ends for the spouse, I guess.
Well, no, not unless they remarry. For example, Mrs. Reagan today still has Secret Service protection. So it remains. They remain under protection until death, unless they remarry.
Now, how does the Secret Service travel with someone they're protecting? Are they on the same plane, as an example? Do they ride in the same next to them, or how does that work?
Well, in present day, it's, there are agents on the same aircraft with the president. And if they're going someplace and it's a extended trip, more than likely there'll be a backup plane. Well, there always is anyway. A plane identical to the presidential plane. And on board that plane will be additional agents. They usually arrive ahead. And then there's always press planes. Usually there'll be some agents on a press plane. So there are agents scattered about, and then other agents from various field offices at the point of arrival, making sure everything's okay.
We're having a conversation with Secret Service agent Clint Hill. Clint, I want to ask you a couple questions about Dallas and that fateful day.
Sure.
I know, and we've talked before about that 60 Minutes interview with Michael Wallace and how you felt responsible for what had happened, even though you were the only one that made any kind of movement, and you jumped on that limousine as quickly as you could. When you went to Dallas, which was a number of years later, and you saw how short that shot was, did that change your opinion as far as whether or not you could have done anything any different?
Oh, yes. When I went to Dallas, it was 1990. And I went to Dealey Plaza, walked the area, went up into the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository. I came away knowing that I did everything I could that day. There wasn't anything else I could have done, considering how fast it happened, the position of the shooter, the angle from which he had the advantage shooting at us from the back. So there really wasn't anything more that I could have done that I did do. Just unfortunate I couldn't get there faster.
Sure. Now that thing, if I remember right, I haven't been to Dallas, but it's on my bucket list. I'd like to see that. It's about an 80-yard shot with him moving in a straight line down that road.
It's an absolute straight line. Didn't have to move the weapon left or right, just change the elevation slightly. It's a lot shorter shot than one really realizes. I'm not even sure it's 80 yards. The first shot probably is less than that.
Wow.
And so he had every advantage that day. We didn't have any, and thus that's what happened. That's why he was assassinated.
Well, and again, Clay was in the Army, I was in the Marines, and those kind of shots are chip shots. I mean, because you don't even start qualifying to 100, 200, and 500 yards. So that's a chip shot.
Yeah, it was a very simple shot.
Yeah.
A lot more so than most people realize.
Did President Kennedy's, he had that back brace, did that back brace hold him up because he didn't fall over just a little bit into his wife's lap, but for the most part he was still pretty erect? Did that back brace create a problem for him?
Sure it did, yes. Back brace created a problem, plus the configuration of the car. The governor and Mrs. Connolly were seated in jump seats immediately in front of President and Mrs. Kennedy. The back of those jump seats are right up against the knees of the people sitting in the back seat, in this case, President and Mrs. Kennedy. His back brace precluded him from going forward at all, hardly. So when he fell to his left, toward Mrs. Kennedy. That was really the only direction he could go, because he was sitting right against the right inner side of the car.
And something else that kind of stuck in my mind, and I think this is mentioned in both books, where Mrs. Kennedy on the flight back looked at you and said, "What's going to happen to you?" She was concerned about you.
Yes, that was somewhat surprising to me, but knowing her as well as I did, I knew she was always concerned, not only about me, but about the other agents that were there. And I was very surprised that she called for me and made that comment to me that she wanted to know if I was going to be okay, what was going to happen to me. And I told her I would be okay.
Now,
but that was just the kind of lady she was.
Sure. Now, Clint, with the struggle you had, and I understand it, for 27 years after the event, if you had gone to Dallas earlier and seen the layout of it, do you think that would have helped you with that struggle you had gone through?
No question.
Okay.
That's the problem that I had, is that I was unable to confront the situation. Had I gone to Dallas much, much earlier, it would have been much better for me to do. And that's, I think, true today of people who suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. is they really need to confront the issue and do it somewhat publicly. I mean, with family and friends, and they need to talk about the situation that they're in. And if you can get that out like that, it's so much better for the person involved. Very beneficial.
You know, over the years, there's been a lot of talk about a conspiracy or an inside job. Any truth to any of that you can think of?
I haven't heard one conspiracy that makes any sense or has any sense of credibility at all. Insofar as I know, there is no evidence that would indicate anything other than there were 3 shots fired in Daly Plaza that day. They all came to the same location, the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository, all fired by the same rifle. And that rifle was fired by one individual, Lee Harvey Oswald. No one else was involved.
You know, I'm sorry that he was killed. We lost a lot of information there.
Well, that was really something terrible for us, because we really wanted to get to him and talk to him and find out the motivation why he did this.
Mm-hmm. Well, and again, the 2 books, 5 Days in May, which is a story about the assassination.
It's 5 days in November.
I'm sorry, did I say May? It's been a long day. 5 days in November. 5 days in November, which talks about the actual 5 days around the assassination from somebody who was there. And then the other book is Mrs. Kennedy and Me, and Clint Hill was the lead man for Mrs. Kennedy's detail. And there's going to be a 3rd book coming out, and where he's going to talk about his time in the Secret Service from 1958 to 1975. We highly, highly recommend the books. And Clint, again, thank you so much for being here and coming on the show. And we'll talk to you when the 3rd book comes out.
Well, I look forward to it, and thank you very much for this opportunity.
We will see you in 167 hours on Taking Care of Business on Koerner Radio News Talk 1180.